So, Yuma, my name is Quentin Grafton, and I'm the convener of the Water Justice Hub, which, as you know, we're launching right here today, this morning in Canberra time. It also coincides with World Rivers Day, which is no coincidence. So I first of all want to acknowledge the land on which I'm standing and which all of us here in this room are sitting. It's the country of the Ngunnawal Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the water and on the land on which we stand. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal Nation, and I acknowledge that they never ceded sovereignty over their country, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So the order of ceremony today is, as you know, you came through the entrance. There are disinfectant areas for you if you wish to disinfect your hands. If you want to leave this room and go to the facilities, to the washroom, you go out of this room and turn to the right, and then you'll find the facilities at the end of the corridor. So this event is in two parts. The first part is just me welcoming you to the event. And then there's going to be a welcome to country, and we're very privileged to have a Ngunnawal elder here herself, Dr. Aunty Matilda House. So thank you. Before Aunty comes on to give us welcome to country, I just want to highlight, following the welcome to country, we'll have Professor Helen Sullivan, Director of the Crawford School of Public Policy, and then followed by myself briefly. And then I'm very welcome Hub members, Dr. Virginia Marshall from the Australian National University, and Dr. Sheri Longboat from the University of Guelph. So she'll be coming into us via Zoom from Canada. I want to remind you that we have a tea break at 11:15 a.m. here in Canberra time, and that'll be for 15 minutes. You're welcome to mingle, talk, and I also want to highlight to you that in this National Portrait Gallery of Australia, there is, in fact, a portrait of Dr. Aunty Matilda House. It's just a few meters out of this room, and you can see her portrait if you wish at that break or afterwards. I would ask you in the time of COVID to respect social distancing. We have social distancing around the table. When I would ask you to respect that when we're drinking and eating. And I think that's enough for the beginning. I welcome you all here, Yuma, to this launch, and it's my real privilege to be able to welcome now Dr. Aunty Matilda House to give us welcome to country, which is a tradition that we do here. Thank you.
I bought my possum drum. It's going to be drummed into you all today, how we're going to be. Hello. You've got a beautiful beard.
He's got a good heart.
I'm sorry about you, but it's just that he's got a longer beard. Okay. Thank you very much. My possum drum. Welcoming everybody into the land of the Ngambri people. And with this, I say mudder. Mudder is the pathway. Mudder is what we're doing today. Mulungari and Yarabi. Mulungari, alive and well. And that's how we want to make sure all the waters in all our land for Yarabi to walk around with a footpath. I want to welcome you all here to this beautiful, beautiful land. And I do hope when I look through the book, it speaks to you. It speaks to you. And I want to thank the organisers for what's happening here today, because we must learn to know and to appreciate Mother Earth. To appreciate Mother Earth, we can't destroy it. And it's not through just, saving all our waters, but it's also how we're going to cope when we talk to the mining companies as well. and to all of those. And the biggest one that we have to know and get to and fight for is the government. Governments. We can all go home and be happy, little Vegemites, but the people who need the things we think we don't need because we can walk into a shower every morning or a bath every night. Doesn't work like that. Mother Earth needs you. So please, I want to welcome you here to this beautiful land of my ancestors of Black Harry and Helen, and also of my great-great-grandfathers and grandmothers. Here before me, when the beautiful river that ran through this country, the Mononglo. But as usual, it took an American to come out and build a lake. We had to have a lake, they said. So Robert Menzies said, build a lake. It ruined all the proper things that was running on the sides of that river for us. We could never regain it back. And I can remember when the lake was trying so hard to be filled up. There was big mud holes everywhere. Can anyone remember that? Am I the oldest one here today? Darling, you might remember. Yes, see? It was all mud holes. And I was there when Robert Menzies was opening the lake. All was there was mud holes. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Because people like yourself are here and you will make sure that all our waters will be right. I won't hold you up, but I'm going to stay around for a little while and have a couple with you, if you don't mind. Okay, thank you very much. This is my possum drum. We make them all the time. Now you can clap. Thank you so much. You have to take that. Yeah, thank you. I'll trip over.
Oh, yeah, well, sorry.
There's no water or fish in there. Oh my God. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Aunty Matilda. So in terms of the event and before morning tea at 11:15, I have an order, and the next person up, and I'm very grateful, my boss and a special person, Professor Helen Sullivan, who's Director of the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Thank you, Helen.
There's only a couple of occasions when academics in the Crawford School of Public Policy call me their boss. Events like this and events or occasions when I'm doing something that they don't like. So I much prefer this kind of incident. I'm really delighted to be here at the launch of this incredibly important initiative. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and extend my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. This is a hugely important initiative at a very, very challenging time. And what makes this such an important initiative for the Australian National University is that it speaks to the mission of the university, which is both about research and education, but also particularly is focused on making a difference in the world, making a difference in terms of the major public policy challenges of our time, making a difference in terms of working with and understanding and learning from first Australians, both in terms of our research and our education, but also in terms of our public policy decisions. And finally, thinking about how we do public policy and how we do it as well as we can. These are things that many universities will reflect on and talk about, but this is something that is built into the mission of the university. And so this initiative, the Water Justice Hub, is central to the purpose of the Australian National University. And it does one of the things that we find so difficult very often as academics, as policymakers, and as stakeholders. It brings together a range of people from different backgrounds and disciplines and expertise and experience. And it claims that the coming together of that range of people and expertise and experience can, with the right tools, the right resources, and the sufficient amount of time, come up with some solutions to these very challenging problems. Problems which have resulted in huge inequalities and incredible experiences of disadvantage, deprivation, and discrimination. Now, water is not the only policy question that confronts us. There are many others. And Australia is, like many countries, in the grip of really having to come to terms with the failures of things that it has done in the past and the possibility that it might not be able to respond, perhaps in the way that it's used to solve problems in the future. And as the director of Crawford School, which is a school of public policy, my interest, of course, is how we think about the potential of public policy to reach for new solutions. And one of the challenges that public policy itself has experienced over the last 30, 40 years is both the dominance of a particular way of thinking. So whatever the policy question is, we apply the same rationale to it, but also a recognition, a creeping recognition that actually we've not done terribly well, that our solutions, our proposals, particularly in the area of major challenges, have not been sufficient. They've not been adequate. And one of the things that's done, which is positive, is that it has, in the minds at least, I'm not going to talk about politicians, but certainly in the minds of bureaucrats and policy analysts, it has engendered some humility, that actually knowledge and experience and expertise can be found outside of either the university or the bureaucracy. And that has opened up the possibility of voice and inclusion and involvement to a range of people who have different sources of knowledge, different sources of expertise. And that gives us the possibility of collaborating with humility. Now, if we're to do that in a way that gives us any chance of solving the problems that we face, then I think we could do much worse than look at the pattern of work that the Water Justice Hub is beginning to develop. It's thinking about three things that are absolutely critical to Crawford, but I think are critical to the way in which the hub works, but also to maybe how we ought to think about public policy. It's focusing on sustainability, it's focusing on integrity, and it's focusing on capability. Now, those things may, at one and the same time, feel somewhat idealistic and out of reach, but also may feel quite prosaic. But they are critically important. If we cannot think about our social, economic, political, cultural systems in ways that are sustainable, we will not meet the challenges that we face. And this is about thinking through the rules of engagement. Who gets to make those rules? Who gets to make key decisions? How are the rules of engagement framed? And also, following from that, how are resources distributed, to whom and for what purpose? Now, oddly, when people talk about sustainability and the public policy challenges, they tend to get stuck on that as being the thing that's too challenging. I don't think that's the case. I think that we have sufficient expertise and experience to understand what we need to do and to understand how we need to do it. The biggest challenge for me comes in the second area, which is integrity. Because we cannot, as a society, continue to make decisions that reflect the particular preferences of a group of people who hold power, not because they've been elected, but because they have influence, or they have monetary resource, or they control the media, or whatever it is that gives them privileged access to decision making, which it further advantages them. So our systems of governance need to be integrous. They need to have an ethical dimension to them, which we in Australia take for granted. But every day we see evidence of our systems not behaving as well as they should. And that, for me, is the bigger challenge. And the third dimension of this is capability. And the Water Justice Hub is demonstrably focused on how do we build capability, research capability, education capability, the capability to make policies that are sustainable. And that's absolutely essential if it is to fulfill its mission. So I think this is a hugely important initiative. I think it is an initiative that has come at absolutely the right time and is led by a range of people I have huge admiration for, both in terms of their expertise, but also their determination to see this realised, this important initiative realised. And I'd just like to finish by saying that very often, particularly at the moment, things can feel hopeless. It can feel as if we are in the grip of things that are beyond us. And what is evident, I think, is both represented in the extraordinary wisdom and experience of Aunty Matilda, is that we have experiences in this country of peoples who have lived and developed ways of living that are sustainable, that are integrous, that work with developing forms of capability. And if we need some inspiration for thinking about what can we do differently, then perhaps we might spend a little bit of time situating ourselves in the space of utopian thinking. Now, the hard-nosed economists and rationalists among you will say, that's all for the birds. But utopian thinking is important because it allows us to think free of the constraints within which we're currently operating. It allows us to conceive of a possibility, a future that is not hampered immediately by, but we don't have institutions to support this. We don't have organisational structures that can work in this way. So I would encourage us all to perhaps spend a little bit of time working with utopia, and not that utopia. Those of you who are public servants and might know that's not the utopia I'm talking about, but to allow us to free ourselves to think differently and to bring our experience and expertise to this incredibly important question and challenge for our time. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this this morning. It's a huge privilege, and I really look forward to hearing other contributions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen, for your speech and inspiration for us. And I'd like to give you some inspiring words. They're not mine. You talked about integrity, which is key to what we're attempting to do here in this Water Justice Hub. Without integrity, without trust, this will not work. So you can't have justice without trust. You can't have justice without integrity. And so hope was the word that you mentioned towards the end of your speech. And so here are the words that I took from a source by Paul Shelson. Hope is a conspiracy that the way things are not the way they have to be. And we are invited to join. So join us, please, in the Water Justice Hub in terms of that hope, in terms of what difference we want to make. So I wanted to give you some words in my own brief speech, and I want to make it clear to people who are coming in live stream from various countries in the world at this very moment. And I'm going to give you a little bit of understanding of Australia. Now, I'm talking to the converted in this room, so please forgive me for the people who are here on the live event. But for people who are beaming in from other parts of the world, I just want you to understand something about Australia, okay? So picture Australia and a map of Australia, and picture in that map, okay, all the Indigenous Australians, the Aboriginal Australians, the people who have been here since time immemorial, people who have been here probably for more than 60,000 years, okay? And picture that map full of people everywhere, in the mountains, in the coast, in the forests, okay, around the rivers, around the lakes, and yes, the deserts, every single place, including the islands, not just the continent of Australia. So picture that, and I want you to keep that in mind when we talk about water justice, where we were in 1788 and where we are in 2020. And understand that the Indigenous people of Australia are still here. These are the first peoples, and that they maintain and they have sacred links to their country and to their ancestors. So now let me talk about water justice. Water justice is not just about Australia, of course. There is water injustice in Australia. It's bigger. There's water injustice pretty much everywhere in the world. And we've got a lot to do at the Water Justice Hub. And I want to talk to you about my understanding of justice, okay? There are three components to this understanding of justice. It's not original to me. People have come up with this from the past. The first point is basic justice. Okay, so basic justice is a basic human needs and rights to water. And we're talking about the ability to drink water that I'm drinking at my table and feel comfortable to drink that water and not be concerned that I'm going to get ill either today or in a chronic way. That's what I'm talking about. We're talking about access to water to be able to bathe, to be able to do the sorts of things that every one of us would expect to be able to do. We're talking about water justice in the time of COVID, where 40% of the world's population cannot wipe and wash their hands as they need to. Okay, that's what we're talking about, is water injustice. We need to change this, we need to transform this. And it's typical for us here in a wealthy country, a rich country like Australia, to think that this is just a low-income problem. Oh, it's a problem in whatever country you want to comes to mind. Well, it's sad to tell you this, but and you should know this, that it's happening right now, right here in Australia. There are people living in remote communities that don't have basic human needs in the context of their water right now. So we need to do something about that. There are remote communities, so they're not millions of people, but there are thousands of people. And of course, if we took on a global context, there's more than 2 billion people, at least 2 billion, who don't have access to what we would consider to be adequate potable water. There's more than 4 billion people who don't have access to the water that's adequate for sanitation purposes. And it's not just a rich country issue in terms of Australia. So those coming in and connecting from the United States, there are 80 million or so Americans who are drinking water that doesn't meet drinking water that has violations in terms of safe water standards. So this is a problem for the entire world that we have to deal with. That's basic water justice. Well, it's not just that basic water justice. There's an issue of distributional justice. And that goes beyond just meeting the basic needs, which we must do. And that's this idea of a fair share for all. So what do I mean by a fair share for all? Well, I'll give you an example from Australia. Okay, Aboriginal corporations, Aboriginal communities have 0.2% of the water rights in the state of New South Wales and within the Murray-Darling Basin. They represent approximately 10% of the population. That's not a fair share for all. By any means is that a fair share for all. So that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what a virtuous person would consider to be a fair share. That's what we're talking about in terms of water justice as well. And there are water sharing plans right now that exist in 2020 in the state of New South Wales. I don't want to pick on New South Wales, but it just happens to be the examples I want to refer to here. There are water sharing plans that have meant that there have been extractions upstream, which have resulted in downstream communities that have priority in terms of town water supply, not getting their water months in advance in terms of a drought. So in other words, they would have had months of supply if those extractions had not been allowed to take place under the water sharing plans. And then there's a word of Uncle Badger Bates, who's a Bakanji elder, who's in the lower Darling River in the Murray-Darling Basin. These are his words, they're not my words. He's referring to the Barker, the Darling River. The river is everything. It's my life, my culture. You take the water away from us, we've got nothing. That's what I talk about in terms of water injustice. That's distributional water injustice. So we need to do something in that dimension as well. And then there's a third dimension to water justice, and that is a dimension of procedural justice. And what do I mean by that? It means that those people who are affected by decisions have a respected voice and a respected seat at the table when those decisions are made. And I can tell you that Indigenous Australians, and not just Indigenous Australians, but I'm highlighting them in my speech today, do not have respected voice at table in terms of key decision-making with respect to water. That must change. But of course, there are others who aren't at that table. Helen talked to us about people with influence. There are key decisions that are made by a very, very small number of people. We need to have distributional justice. We need procedural justice. And so what do we need? What is the vision forward in terms of justice? Well, I don't have to create my own vision of what that might be, but I think for us in Australia and for those people joining us from overseas, it's worthwhile to highlight something that was very special. And I have hope that it will happen. It hasn't happened yet. But in 2017, there was a National Constitutional Convention of Aboriginal Nations. And they have a declaration, it's a statement. It's a one-page statement you can pick up and easily read. It's an amazing document. And they talked about the need to be heard, which is what I'm talking about in terms of procedural justice. And that's not just water. This is all about country and history. And they invited all of us, all peoples of Australia, to walk with them. And this is their words, not mine. In a movement of the Australian people, that's all of us here in Australia, for a better future. Isn't it time we took this generous offer up? And in so doing, deliver truth and justice. So let me close by just highlighting some of the important partners that we have in the context of the Water Justice Hub. There are communities that we would like to work with, that we're reaching out to, and we'll have a value propositions for them. I can't mention them because we haven't partnered with them yet, but that's where we're heading. But I also want to highlight UNESCO. UNESCO established a chair at the ANU in 2010, and I'm very grateful for their support over the years. And I want to especially thank the Australian Research Council that has provided 5 years of funding for the Water Justice Hub, or at least the research that will be going into and supporting the Water Justice Hub. And so what do we do? I got asked this question on radio this morning. Well, what actually do you do? And a very legitimate question, a very pertinent question. Are you a lobbyist? I said, no, I'm not a lobbyist. I said, are you an advocate? I said, well, I'm an advocate for water justice. I'm not an advocate for any political party or platform. So yes, I'm an advocate for water justice. I believe that the members of the Water Justice Hub are advocates for water justice, but that doesn't mean we're lobbyists. I don't have access to parliamentarians. I don't have access to senators. I can't knock on their doors. I can't have access to them. That's not what we're talking about. We are truth tellers. And what do I mean by truth tellers? Well, we live in a post-truth world. Okay, that's a misused term, I suppose, but it's basically the idea that opinion, not facts, count as much as facts. Okay, that's a problem. That's a real problem. It's a problem globally, okay? It's a problem everywhere, and it's a problem in water as well. So we seek to provide, as best as we can, the truth, evidence that goes through peer review processes, that gets debated, and then provide that evidence to the communities in a value proposition that may help them in their struggle for water justice. And I want to highlight to you, of course, I'm talking to you from Canberra, the nation's capital of Australia, but I know people are coming in from different parts of the world. And I highlighted UNESCO, which is based in Paris in France. And I want to highlight this is a bigger problem that we will also take into account. And so the thing I want to highlight to you, of course, is that we have sustainable development goals. They're called the SDGs. And there's a very critical set of goals in terms of SDG 6, in the context of water, water for all. And that has to be delivered by 2030. That's the goal. And I can tell you right now, categorically, we will not deliver SDG 6. We probably won't deliver a number of those SDGs, but we certainly won't deliver on SDG 6. So that tells us there is water injustice that is going to continue well beyond 2030. So there's a lot of work afoot for us. And I wanted to highlight a declaration that I didn't write, but I did sign this declaration. I think it has some context in terms of what we're trying to do within the Water Justice Hub. And it was signed in February 2017 at the Vatican. These are the words there. All have a part, that's all of us, have a part to play in achieving societies of justice, solidarity, equality, committed to the care for our common home. And that is a vision that's out there that I'd like to follow in a personal way. So how do we achieve that? Well, there's a number of ways we can achieve that. Each will work in their own particular space. But I think there's three key things that have to be done in a collective way, a set of outcomes. And the first goes back to this basic water justice. We've got to secure basic water needs for everybody, everywhere, for all time. And here in Australia, we need to deliver that right now. In a rich country like Australia, not delivering that for thousands of Australians is totally unacceptable. Second, we need to ensure, maintain or improve or have better condition of our watersheds, our streams, our rivers, and our aquifers. That's critical to our sustainable future. And then the third, and certainly not last point, is we need better and just water planning, management, and governance. There are key principles that have already been developed about governance, but we just need to implement them. We have some wonderful principles in Australia, some wonderful principles, but we have failed to implement them. So it's not a principle issue, it's an implementation issue. So on this day here, it's the 28th of September here in Australia, in Canberra, but it's the 27th of September in some parts of the world at the moment. And the 27th of September is World Rivers Day 2020. So let us make us all collectively have a common vision for a shared world, a reality. And I close with these words, which are my words. Together, let us all commit to delivering water justice for all. So thank you for your time and listening to me. There are many others that will be coming up to the podium and talking this morning, friends and colleagues and members of the Water Justice Hub. So the next person up is a friend and colleague, and that is Dr. Virginia Marshall. She is a Wiradjuri Nyemba woman, and she is the inaugural Indigenous Postdoctoral Fellow of the Australian National University. So as you come out, Virginia, there's a green X here. Please stand at the green X. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Before you start, I just want to say, Mr. Williams, yes. I'm sure we're related.
Oh my God.
Oh, well, I'm Williams too.
Yeah.
That's my maiden name is Williams.
Okay.
So just because your colour and this colour don't mean nothing. We're probably related.
Good.
Thank you very much for that talk, Helen. And I'll catch you all later.
Thank you.
I'm sorry I can't stay, but school holidays are starting, and I've got 4 great-grandchildren.
Thanks so much.
They're all trying to sort their lives out to be with me. Have a lovely day.
Narin Marang, UN Nadi Dr. Virginia Marshall, Niyani Bala Murun Buiginya, Maramara Yalbinya Nina, Wiradjuri Nagambi Nanawal, Nurambanga, Niyani Bala Narar Mara Palumbun, Gijalgu, Wiradjuri Nagambi Nanawal. Niyani Bala Narar Mara, Nun Amiligo, Nuram Pangu, Wiradjuri Nagambi Nanawal. Niyani Bala Narar Mali, Dala Bomayi, Wiradjuri Nagambi Nanawal. Miyangang Galangu, Niyani Nindi Marangbang, Biam Bulgo, Murugaigu, Mai Galangu Ni Agu, Nurambangu, Mandang Gugu. Thank you. To honour and respect the oldest living culture on earth, central to identity for Aboriginal people is law and culture, and it is the obligation for caring for country. Science now confirms that Aboriginal people manage this continent with an outstanding level of sophistication and insight. Millennia of caring for country created a landscape and waterscape that was mega biodiverse, flourishing with wildlife, highly productive, with stable soils and riverbanks. Science also confirms what our politicians are only beginning to realise. Aboriginal insights into land and water management in a changing climate are vital to reversing the degradation of the land and rivers of this nation. The massive fish kills in the Darling River in New South Wales last year stunned the nation, but it grieved traditional owners deeply. We feel grief when we see dying landscapes and river systems. We feel grief when we see dying river systems and our identity. And we want to ensure that the future is not one of poor fella my country. Aboriginal people seek a respectful partnership in caring for this land, caring for the rivers and wetlands. We seek a respectful partnership that honours our heritage and our inherent rights. Just as the High Court Mabo decision overturned the repugnant doctrine of terra nullius and brought about Aboriginal land rights, it is time to overturn the prevailing doctrine of aqua nullius and bring water justice to this nation and the world over. For Aboriginal people, water justice means restoring our water rights and healing our relationships with country. It means providing what is recognised internationally as a basic human right. Indigenous people seek more than this. Water justice means the recognition of Aboriginal rights to economic water, not just cultural flows. We know that water is the lifeblood of rural and remote communities and the foundation of prosperity. The denial of water rights to Aboriginal people is no longer acceptable, not now and not ever. Aboriginal people are seeking an equitable share of Australia's resources, Indigenous resources, an equitable share in the prosperity that derives from water ownership and use. We are working in partnership with all Australians to build a prosperous and sustainable future for all. We are also seeking Indigenous water justice. Manangulu. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Virginia. And we're going to try and connect to Sheri Longboat. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to Sheri, and that's hopefully all the technology will do the whiz bang and she'll be able to appear on screen for us. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. So Sheri and Kat Taylor, who you'll see later on this morning, and I published a paper in the last 12 months, which was on the issue of water governance and the lack of respect in the context of Indigenous rights. So where's Sheri? Well, Sheri is, I said, in Canada. She's at the University of Guelph. She is a Haudenosaunee Mohawk and a band member of the Six Nations of the Grand River. She is in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph, and I just see Sheri right now. So I'm going to pass over to you, Sheri. So I presume you're not muted and you're all ready to go. So please, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh. Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. That's all I can see on the screen here. Well, thank you, everyone. It's 9 p.m. here in Ontario, Canada, and I'm just so thankful to be here and appreciate hearing the speakers that have come before me. I've learned a lot, and I feel like I'm with like-minded and kindred spirits in some of what I've heard already. So yeah, just a bit about me. First, I want to acknowledge where I am coming from. I'm in Southern Ontario, Canada, so just about an hour west of Toronto. But these are the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Attawandaron, Métis peoples, and many Indigenous peoples who have called these lands home, who have found these as traditional territories and maintain a deep and spiritual, intimate and historic relationship with these treaty and territorial lands. And it's to give respect and thanks to this land and the waters that we're here to talk about today. Also reminding that a teaching that I've been given is to bring water to the meetings, so that while we're here speaking about water, water should have a voice at the table. And that's become focus of what I think about when I think of water justice. So when I think of water justice, and that's what I was asked to speak about today, I come with it with two minds at sometimes. When I think about justice, what initially comes to mind as an academic Western trained researcher is I think of water security and some of the discussion we've had of the human rights to water, human access to water, clean, reliable, safe drinking water, access to water for sanitation, for health, for all the reasons that we need basic water for basic needs. And also for our livelihoods, for our livelihood enhancement in some of our communities, for economic development, for growth, for all those needs towards spirit, culture, economics, as well as recreation, and as well as fishing. All of these types of activities that we typically think of when we think of water, coming from what I often will say is more of a water management perspective or a water security perspective. And this is critically important. This perspective is so critically important, particularly as we've talked about Indigenous peoples, myself coming from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, Haudenosaunee communities, where just an hour outside of Toronto in the Great Lakes water basin, where we have a fifth of the world's fresh water, the community is unable to drink the water, contaminated groundwater, and lack of infrastructure where many of the homes are still not connected to a clean, safe water supply. And this is in Southern Ontario. So safe drinking water, water justice to ensure access to safe drinking water is critical. It's important for Indigenous people internationally and within Canada. And that's the focus of where I look at my academic research, and something that also drives me personally, this injustice. And as was mentioned before, this basic needs is one of those levels. Many of you may know that there is a water crisis here in Canada. It's been recognized by the UN Rapporteur, Human Rights Rapporteur, Human Rights Watch, the Auditor General of Canada, that there's a current water crisis here in Canada where at any given time over 100 First Nations, Indigenous communities are unable to access safe drinking water, either for lack of contaminated source water, from lack of infrastructure, from just having the inability to maintain water throughout their communities. And this crisis has been recognized by our federal government, and our current Prime Minister has committed to end all of these drinking water, boil water advisories by March 2021. But initial reports and some of the statistics that are coming in now and say that this is well below the mark, and these goals will not be achieved by the timelines. So that plays deeply in my thoughts and in my mind and in my research, that these basic needs are something that as Indigenous peoples in Canada we're lacking. And to me, sometimes I think that's it goes without saying that it's just unacceptable. But then I also have a second view, and I think it was where I say I've come with two minds, because then I do come with the Indigenous perspective, where I think of what I've learned, what I think of what our teachings, the Haudenosaunee teachings from creation story, from the Great Law, from the Code of Handsome Lake, from our ceremonies and our knowledge, things that I continue to learn and continue to pull into my research and learn from those knowledge holders that seek to continue these ways of learning, knowing, doing, and being. And when I think of this way, I think of those original instructions. I think of some of the stories that have been told to me in the teachings that are shared by the Ongohomwe, the Anishinaabe water walkers, Josephine Mondamin, and other women who have walked each of the Great Lakes, offering ceremony, fulfilling responsibilities, and in doing so, raising awareness and empowering the next generation of people to do the same, to uphold our rights and to uphold our being as Indigenous peoples, and to uphold our responsibilities, to take back our responsibility and ensure that we're speaking for the water and bringing the water to the tables, to the meetings, to have a voice for water. And as it was mentioned, this view comes from the notion that water is alive, water is a spirit, water is the lifeblood of Mother Earth and provides our very existence. And it's all with which we rely upon. So I think of water as life. I think of the spirit of water. I think of it being alive, and that is having a fulfilled manifestation and goals for itself, its own responsibilities. And then it's from this view that I start to think the spiritual, this holistic lens, this Indigenous view. And it's from this view that I deviate from water as just being a basic need, because from that lens, I feel it's being put in a human-centric way, is putting us at the center of it and saying it's before our needs, as well as ecosystems needs often, but still to ensure that it's meeting our needs. But then when I take the spiritual view of water, that's what I've learned from some of my teachings and from those that I work with. I learned that water justice means justice for water to fulfill its responsibilities. If we allow water to fulfill its responsibilities, to take care of it, to honor water, it will provide for all of creation. And in doing so, it will support the continuation of life. It will allow us to meet our economic, our social, environmental, our recreational needs. But we need to put water at the center. We have to have water at the table. We have to make decisions for water, the continuation of life of water and all of it sustains. But sometimes it's rhetoric, and sometimes it's easy to say, and that's where some of my research focuses, and that's where those that I work with speak to. It's how do we do this? How do we begin to take these words and the spirit and bring it into action? And when I think of this, for me, I think of it as in terms of where we are now with respect to Indigenous rights. And I was happy to hear previous speakers speak of this, about these rights, whether it be water rights, whether it be property rights, and looking at water. But I also think, what of the right of water itself to have its rights? We're seeing on the international scale in New Zealand and in different countries around the world now, where water has been given its own rights. And I see that as a step towards what we need to be doing. So for me, it's the implementation of the recognition of Indigenous rights, at least here in Canada. And I hear this worldwide in others that I have spoken to in different research, for example, in Latin America, where instruments such as the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is giving voices to Indigenous peoples to stand up and assert their rights and responsibilities, take care of the water, and to support the water. So for this recognition of Indigenous rights and governance, of being able to fulfill, to bring these Indigenous laws to the table, to speak for water, to be there, I think is critical. And when we begin to recognize these rights, then we can begin to recognize the inherent rights of water, and that water has its own rights for decisions for which it can be made. So this also means for me the codification of within Indigenous laws. In many of our teachings across North America or Turtle Island, when we speak of some of the First Nations and the Indigenous peoples, or those from the North, the Inuit, I speak with some Métis peoples in Ontario, there's commonalities of our teachings, of ways of respecting water, of empowering water, of taking care of water. So if we look to these Indigenous laws, to these knowledge, to these ceremonies, to these original instructions, they provide us the way for living balance with creation, including water. And if we return to these ways, then that's how we can begin to respect water and care for water, and then allow her to fulfill her responsibilities. But this involves a transition, a transformation in the way we think, the way we view water, and the institutions for how we govern and manage water. And it's going to involve that Indigenous peoples are at that table. And it's going to involve some of what I look at as place-based policy. It may be beyond the time where we're implementing watershed scale solutions, but it may be looking at the local level. And it certainly is the involvement of Indigenous peoples. So as I thought about the how do we begin? And that's some of the work that I'm beginning to do now at the local level, where some water is looking at governance. I look at governance with some of the communities I work with at the local scale. We have First Nations communities that are operating under historic colonial institutions such as the Indian Act that limits those communities from being able to exercise any control or power over their water systems. So at that level of governance, we're trying to empower communities to take control, to be able to invigorate their own laws, their own traditional governance of decision-making, of relating to, fulfilling their responsibilities to say, how do we want to manage our communities in our relationship with water? But that's only at the local scale. As we know, the activities at the watershed scale is where we need to protect source water for Indigenous peoples. Right now, the communities that are struggling for safe drinking water often are dealing with infrastructure issues. But as quickly as we can support the solutions at addressing the infrastructure, we also need to have equally those robust solutions for protecting source water. And currently in most areas across Canada, unless it's under self-governance agreements, Indigenous communities and peoples are not involved in watershed scale decision-making, or certainly not in Ontario. So we need to be acting at that scale as well. And lastly, at the national scale or the large scale, where we have to have those national, in Canada here, at least we lack a federal water policy. We have some water policy from the 80s that is not robust with respect to water security. So we need that at that level. And Indigenous peoples with rights to territories and Indigenous inherent rights should also be at those tables. And as I wrap up, I think of a couple additional summary notes that I've made here. Where do we begin? Certainly we need to secure basic needs. We need to have basic needs covered in every First Nations community. Nobody should be unable to turn on their taps and have safe drinking water. The next is to honor the spirit of water and decision making, and to bring that water to the table. I speak with some elders and we said we need to be thinking with that mind and be conducting our ceremonies as we begin those meetings to feel the spirit of water, so that we can be guided in a way that we know we're making good, wise decisions, coming with a good mind. We need to recognize the implementation of Indigenous rights and governance. Often we hear we have Indigenous rights that are constitutionally recognized, but yet we really struggle to see them implemented in any substantive way where we can say Indigenous peoples are in fact governing. There's opportunity there. We need to honor those historic obligations of treaty and land rights that fail to be respected here in Canada. At any given time now, we can see communities and going through reclamation, or what we see take the land back initiatives, or what's often called protest, where really it's Indigenous peoples asserting their rights to be recognized. Essentially, we need to decolonize those institutions, those water institutions that can continue to marginalize Indigenous peoples. I believe by bringing Indigenous peoples to the table with those teachings and those understandings that the spirit of water can be protected, we can begin to transform those systems. And lastly, we need to ultimately transform those, create new systems, processes, structures, and functions. We need to transform how we look at water and govern water. And in doing so, if we can protect water and ensure that water can fulfill its manifest destiny, water will fulfill it and take care of us. So I think if we begin to think beyond just water as basic needs and looking at water as something that we're managing, I think we begin to manage our relationship with water in a much more holistic, spiritual, culturally appropriate way. In doing so, we begin to ensure we're moving towards water justice. So water justice has many meanings. I tend to look at them both from a practical lens of meeting basic needs, but as well thinking more long-term and more holistically. We need to embrace the Indigenous perspectives and ensure those people and those views are at the table. And in doing that, I think we're a step further ahead to ensuring that we're fulfilling our responsibilities for the next generations of all of creation. I thank you for your time. I hope I stayed within my 5 minutes, and I look forward to hearing the other speakers, and thank you again.
Thanks so much, Sheri, and thank you for connecting with us on a Sunday night on Will Rivers Day in Canada. So I would like to bring to the close the first part of our Water Justice Hub launch. There's an opportunity for those people who here are live to grab some coffee and tea and something else to eat. For those who are joining us via Zoom or those joining us via live stream, we will be back in 10 minutes. Okay, so we'll keep to the schedule because I know people are looking very carefully at their watches. So we're back in 10 minutes. Don't leave. We'll be back in 10 minutes. The launch will continue. We're just taking a break for 10 minutes. So grab yourself a cup of tea or coffee wherever you might be in the world, and we'll see you back in 10 minutes. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you. I hope you've been able to take a tea or coffee break. We certainly were able to do that here in Canberra. So the event continues. The Water Justice Hub launch continues. And all but one of our speakers will be coming in virtually from different locations, Canada and Western Australia. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Poelina. She is a Nyikina Warrwa woman, and she is chair of the Martuwarra Fitzroy River Council. So over to you, Anne, and thank you.
Right, thank you. Naji Gorijan, Nyamba Boro Yaro, Mabongorian Nganga, Ngai Nganga, Yaro Boro, Mabongorian Nganga, Water Justice Hub, Mabongorian Nganga, Muja. So I'm just acknowledging in my Nyikina language that I'm coming to you from Broome on Yaru and Jugan country. And in my introduction, I said this is an excellent opportunity for all of us to gather and speak about water justice. So I also want to acknowledge my colleagues in the room and across the globe. I also want to acknowledge the peoples of the living waters of the Murray-Darling Basin, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who continue to develop and send message sticks to the Martuwarra, the Fitzroy River in the Kimberley region. So from these lessons we are learning and we are sharing. So one of the things for me is to look at, as Quentin said, I'm in the Fitzroy River catchment, and there's a lot of pressure on what is proposed to be coming to the Fitzroy River. What we're saying is, okay, let's look at what are the lessons that we can learn from the Murray-Darling Basin? What are the lessons that we can learn from looking at water across the globe? And a couple of years ago, I had a colleague from Montpellier come, and we were sitting on the riverbank because for Indigenous people, it's all about stories. Stories are the things that give us meaning. Stories are the things that hold our law. Stories are the things that tell us about the world in which we live and how to live in that world in harmony. As Indigenous people, some of the earlier speakers spoke about the fact that as Indigenous people, we have been here from the beginning of time. We are the water keepers. We are the water guardians. We have a fiduciary duty to protect this living water system. Water is alive. It has energy. It holds memory. And so it's really important to think about it from that perspective. Reading so much information around the world, you kind of go, why haven't the humans got it yet? So from my perspective, I live on country, I'm from country. In my introduction, I said, I am a woman who belongs to the Fitzroy River, the Martuwarra. So from that perspective, we see that as Indigenous people, we come with a gift of knowledge and wisdom, but most importantly, with what I call Indigenous science, because this traditional ecological knowledge, particularly around governing water on the world's oldest arid country, just shows you that we are in a time where not only do Black lives matter, but Indigenous wisdom and First Nations people, wisdom matters. And without this knowledge and wisdom, we have got no chance of dealing with the complexity that we're talking about. We are talking about law of the land, law that is embedded in a sense of place, law that comes from earth-centered governance. I'm very buoyant about the conversation and the connection that I have with the Vatican through Jackie Raymond, and to see the leadership of His Holiness Pope Francis championing the need to really love and care for our rivers. So he has written a love letter to the Amazon, and we are hoping to connect with Pope Francis and the wonderful work he's doing around rivers in the Fitzroy River. So I also want to place my sharing with you today in the fact that the Fitzroy River is possibly going to be the next big story around development around water. And so one of the things we're saying is that how do we do this? How do we learn from the lessons of the Murray-Darling Basin? But more importantly, how do we take the wisdom of our Indigenous elders and factor that into the planning, the evaluation, and the way water is to be developed on just terms? So we've obviously been in a lot of dialogue with government, with other stakeholders, but I want to put the position that Indigenous people are not stakeholders. We are shareholders. And so we have a fiduciary obligation to ensure that the public good of water is the greater good of all. And so from that perspective, we were at a meeting sometime in 2019 where government was sitting in the room and lots of big wigs, and very quietly, one of our senior men stood up and he looked around the room, and his voice was so powerful in the quietness because he said, "You came, you took the land, you made us slaves, now you are back for the water. What is going to be left for blackfella? What is going to be left for Aboriginal people? You've taken everything from us. When are you going to reciprocate? What is your intention? Why are you here?" So this is very, very powerful words that come from our elders in regards to how are we going to do this. So as Quentin said, and as Nadeem has written very recently, respecting that the world's rivers are there, and these are living systems. And so not only do we need to recognise the voices of Indigenous people, but we must recognise the voice and the cries of our rivers globally, where 2/3 of our rivers no longer flow. So what we're doing now is that we're in a time where we're looking at all of these sorts of issues and saying, well, how do we think about water justice? How do we learn from Beryl Carmichael sitting on the Barker and saying, we've done all this, from Badger saying we need this, from Emma Carmody. So we have this collective wisdom in Australia that is framing the way water justice should be done on just terms in our nation. I guess one of the things in terms of the work that I do is to realise that not only are we talking about the critical need to have transdisciplinary science, which also includes Indigenous wisdom, but we are coming at a time where this collective wisdom must create awareness that we are also cautious that what we're talking about, even with overwhelming evidence, that politics is a real issue, and that we need to find ways to generate this body of evidence, all of these stories in film, in song, in dance, in public papers. I noted that Quentin made a reference to a paper that he published with Sheri and Kat, and I also want to let you know that there's been a very interesting journal that's just come out with a collective of water rights in comparative law. And so this is the first time that I'm aware of that such a journal has allowed the Martuwarra Fitzroy River to be the lead author. So what we're saying as Indigenous people is that we must challenge these systems, we must push the boundaries out, we must bring in the collective wisdom to right-size the planet. And I really think that unless we have Indigenous wisdom in there, we are not going to be able to do this. And as I said, a couple of years ago, I had a colleague from Montpellier come, about 6 years ago, and he said to the elders, do you realise Le Meuse is the oldest river in the world? And he was really sort of taken aback that the old people, the elders, didn't jump up and get all excited about that. But what they said to me is that within a week I was back in France, and what they said is, we want you to go and find Le Meuse. We want you to go and take some of the memory of the Martuwarra and go to the Meuse, because if the Meuse is the oldest river in the world, they will share with us what the humans have done. And since that time, what I found out, and it's quite interesting, but we found out that the Finke River in the Northern Territory is now the oldest river in the world. So I'm on a journey that I want to get there to the Finke, and I want to talk with the Finke and say, what are your memories? How can you share with the Martuwarra? So we need to see that these are living systems. Water is alive. It is life. It holds life. It nurtures life. From our perspective in the Kimberley with the Martuwarra Fitzroy River Council, we have redefined cultural values as living water systems because the fact that it is a living spirit. So we have called what some people call cultural flows, living waters, and we stand with the fact that we have a first law. We believe our river is a sacred ancestral being, and as I said, it's just been published recently within the last couple of weeks, the recognising that the Martuwarra's first law, right to life as the living ancestral being. So the Martuwarra has put a story out there to the world. We're looking to share that through the Water Justice Hub. But what we're saying, and I want to just leave with a couple of points, is that Indigenous people do not separate land, water, people and communities. That is intrinsically entwined. That water is a living spirit with a life force, and it holds energy and memory, and we must go with living waters first law first. That rivers are sacred, not only to their right to life, but their right to live and flow, and that we need collective wisdom, Indigenous and transdisciplinary science, but we also need to be aware that politics is a great influencer, that we need evidence in multiple forms, in storytelling, in song, in published papers, in plays, to bring the people with us. What we see globally is the failure of our nation states to govern for the people. And so what we're saying is that with the work that we're doing in the Fitzroy River, what we are doing is that the Fitzroy River has 6 independent Indigenous nations. We declared the Fitzroy River Declaration in 2016. In 2018, we formed the Martuwarra Fitzroy River Council. 1 month ago, we became incorporated. We have a constitution. We are now a legal recognised body. On the 31st of October, we've done some great work with some colleagues sitting in the room, Nadeem and Jason from afar, and we have produced a conservation and management plan for the Fitzroy River, but from a decolonising perspective. What we're saying is that we have the knowledge, we have the wisdom, we have been guarding and looking after this river system from the beginning of time. We have a few greedy frogs that want to come and consume and drink all the water. And what we're saying as a public good, we need to look at the greater good, which is at this point in time, 60% of people who live in the Fitzroy Valley catchment are Indigenous people. What we want as a minimum standard, because some people say, okay, what's your plan B? What we're saying in terms of the politics and the way that this water is to be governed is that from a minimum standard perspective, unless we can see a statutory authority whereby everyone can come to the table, the burden of proof is on developers. We have no faith in the process going forward. So we are working on multiple levels, scientific, traditional knowledge, obviously legal reform and legal pluralism. And what we're saying is that we believe from the perspective, and I just saw an article the other day from the Green Left Weekly, the Murray-Darling Plan has said we must address colonialism. We must address colonialism because not only are we at a point in Australia where colonialism impacts on Indigenous people, but it impacts on every person sitting in that room today. So we need to find ways of building a coalition of hope. We need to stand together in solidarity. There is great work being produced here in the Kimberley, and on the 31st of October, we will launch our plan in the bed of the Fitzroy River, in Fitzroy Crossing, and we will be showcasing that and sharing it with the world. So thank you for the opportunity to be able to zoom in from Yawuru country. To my colleagues sitting at the front of the table there, Brad and Nadeem, thank you for being in that space. To John Williams, who's given us a real big challenge, is how do we get to understand the Fitzroy River catchment before we destroy it? Thank you very much. Kali Amabu.
Thank you so much, and powerful words, First Peoples, First Law and First Rivers. So I next speaker is Professor John Williams, good friend and neighbour and colleague. So over to you, John, please.
Well, thank you very much, Quentin. And to follow Anna, I just don't know what to say, but it's terribly, terribly important. I guess the thing that I'll say first up is that the Water Justice Hub's mission is to respond to the water injustice and to promote a voice and truth-telling in relation to water. And I think the conversation we need now is different to what we've had in the past. We need to recognise that waters and rivers are living things and have a sense of themselves, as Anna has pointed out. The conversation we need in truth-telling is changing, and I think the Water Hub is part of that change. While the Hub will have a primary focus in Australia, and especially the issue of the conversation of our First People, it will also respond to the global challenges of delivering Sustainable Development Goal 6, which is ensure access to water and sanitation for all. And it's important to recognise that the Hub is about something that's fundamental to the human condition. The United Nations General Resolution in 2010 committed the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation as a human right that is essential for the full enjoyment of the life and that of the human condition. So we're dealing with something that is absolutely fundamental to us as human beings, but also to recognise the connection between the human being and the creation and the water and the system itself. So the conversation is changing, and we want to be part of that change. Water justice, as you know, is a combination of social and environmental justice that applies to water allocation, water governance and its management. It not only examines the distribution of outcomes, but also the processes that underpin them. Processes determine perception. Perception of justice and perception of justice processes are fundamentally important. Water justice challenges us to be explicit about the rationales we use to adopt water allocation and management decisions. This hub is about clarifying the rationales, the framing, the values that are used in these decision-making, clarifying and putting on the table that value sets that we come to. All values have a value in themselves and around, but they need to be declared and understood and talked about. In particular, significant when changes in water governance occur due to altered allocation, reforms in the institution rules of the game relevant to water. All this is about governance. And when there are changes in the underlying hydrological regimes due to climate change. This is a new and important conversation. In Australia, water reform, climate change has largely been swept under the carpet. It can't continue to be. And this hub must bring this into the conversation as a very vital part of going forward. Managing for water justice is a necessary, but it's not easy. It's a challenging goal. It's a challenging goal to bring together the science, the social science, the knowledge from our Indigenous people, and bring that together with the value sets that are complex and need to be addressed as we put ourselves in this place. It's not going to be an easy hub, because we are trying to delve and put on the table the justice of how we use water. Issues of justice arrive when resources are and are perceived to be in short supply, and that is very true. and when access to water is restricted or confined. Concerns about getting one's fair share arises when an individual or a group feels that others are taking more than their fair share from a common or a communal resource, such as water. So it's a feel situation. How do individuals feel that it is fair? These are issues we will have to struggle with. And these issues lead to the fact that often results in winners and losers in water resource management. The burden of being the loser can impact negatively on people's livelihoods and on the ecosystem health, which can result in discontent and potentially conflict and social disharmony. When the losers are marginalised communities, disempowerment of individuals or groups, or, importantly too, the natural environment. This can result in social and in environmental injustice, especially if those injustices are continuously perpetuated. And our Canadian people and our Australian Indigenous people are part of that perpetuation. Social justice is a key outcome of water allocation, management and governance. It is commonly expressed in water policies and our strategies in terms of achieving equitable distribution of water resources. But it's important to examine the justice at a number of scales. And some of the injustice occurs when we only consider one scale and do not consider the impacts on others at another scale. For example, in some cases, a just outcome at one level or a scale in a catchment may cause an injustice at another scale or catchment in a basin for the same set of stakeholders. So, for example, in the past year, within the Murray-Darling Basin, there are many smaller communities, such as Wilcannia, that literally ran out of water. It was on the news today of examination of why that was so. Downstream communities that had priority access to water under the law did not get the water they needed because the upstream floodplain capture for irrigation have taken more than their fair share. A matter on the table today in our very parliaments in New South Wales. These Murray-Darling communities were shocked and grieved to see huge fish kills and to be faced with undrinkable water. I was involved with the Academy of Science study, which examined the extent of these tragedies and the extent of the lack of judgment. And my involvement when I was Commissioner of Natural Resources in the establishment of the Red Gum National and Regional Reserves and forests along the Murray Valley exposed me to the injustice faced by our Indigenous people who lived in these forests for thousands of years. While it's important to get the science correct and documented, there is no justice until this knowledge impacts on policy, legislation and compliance. So one of the really important things for this group here in the Justice Hub, that there are issues which the Water Justice Hub will seek to address through provision of robust science, economic, social science analysis and awareness of Indigenous knowledge and history. But we assemble that knowledge, but unless we bring it together in ways that are essential to our function of effective truth-telling, and that's fine and important, but it's the engagement with community, with government, private sector on water policy reform and development, particularly the implementation and upgrade of the National Water Analogy. We've set us some huge goals as a hub, but I believe we are in a place of new conversations that will enrich us as Australians, and we hope enrich communities around the world. Thanks, Quentin.
Thank you so much, John, for your presentation. And the third speaker in the launch today is from after morning tea is Dr. Kat Taylor. So Kat is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Water Justice Hub, the Australian Research Fellowship, and at the Crawford School of Public Policy. So over to you, Kat, please. Click to me. So we can't hear you, Kat. So just double check on the muting. If not, we can, we'll give that another go. Okay, we still can't hear you. I tell you what we're going to do. We'll flip things around. We can flip the order of speakers and we'll get that sorted. So there are two postdoctoral fellows associated with the Water Justice Hub and the Australian Research Council Fellowship. So I'm going to jump to you, if that's okay, to you, Dr. Anna Monero. Oh, I'm going to go to you, Anna. So we'll see if you can get. Let's just see if we can hear you. Speak, please.
Hello?
Yes. Okay, over to you, Anna.
Hi, hello. My name is Anna Monero, and I'm a postdoc research fellow at the Water Justice Hub. I'm working with Professor Quentin Grafton on his Australian Research Council Laureate Fellowship on Water Justice. Today, I am speaking to you from Nuga country in Western Australia's southwest. Nuga country is tremendously rich in groundwater. In winter around Perth, the groundwater table rises close to the surface to form these beautifully rich swamps and wetlands. In summer, these wetlands and swamps mainly go dry. The Nuga people understand groundwater as a manifestation of the life cycle, where the past, the present, and the future are connected and should be cared for. For Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples across the world, water is essential to all forms of life. We all need water to grow our food, to drink, and to wash. Water is also essential to directly supporting the livelihoods of millions of peoples across the world. But water is more than just a resource for us to take and use. Water is alive. Water is an essential part of our culture. Water helps individuals, families, and whole communities come together and feel connected. Water helps us feel connected to each other and feel connected to nature. Our growing body of literature is now showing that the mere fact of just seeing water, of being around water, lowers our levels of stress, of anxiety, and is generally good for our mental health. Why do you think that a house or a hotel room with an ocean view is worth so much more than one without? Why? Just the view of the water. This is because water has a value in itself. And as humans, we appreciate that intrinsic value. We value seeing water. We value being connected to water. A study published in Health Policy focused on Indigenous Australians demonstrated a strong positive association between physical health and caring for country. That is, taking part in cultural ceremonies, spending time in country, protecting sacred areas, and gathering traditional foods. The health benefits derived from these traditional activities in country translated into over $4 million in savings in primary health care. All these intangible water values the health, the well-being, the spirituality, the connection translate into huge economic benefits. The critical question is how to accurately account for these intangible values. And even more critically, how can we make better decisions that both protect these intangible values for all Australians and all the peoples across the world, while at the same time we support economic activities for all the peoples that need large amounts of water, like agriculture or mining. My role as an environmental economist in the Water Justice Hub is to help answer these difficult questions. Incorporating intangible water values into mainstream water planning is not straightforward, but it can be done. I have a mixed background in economics and engineering, which helps me understand both the social and the technical aspects of water management. In 2018, I completed my PhD in environmental and development economics at the Australian National University under the supervision of Professor Quentin Grafton. Before doing my PhD, I worked for 6 years in the Australian water industry. I worked for 4 years as an engineering consultant doing hydraulic and hydrogeological studies, as well as design of irrigation systems. I worked in the public sector and for an oil and gas company designing water management plans. After 12 years of being in Australia, I call Australia home. I am immensely fortunate and grateful to be able to live and raise my young family in what is and will always be the land of Australia's First Peoples. I am excited to be part of the Water Justice Hub and dedicate my work as a researcher to advancing water justice, advancing life justice for all Australians and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. And we're going to go to Vic Adamowitz next. I'll do a brief introduction to you, Vic, and we'll close with you, Dr. Kat Taylor. So I've known Vic for, I think, 30 years now. Certainly a long time, and it's my real pleasure to introduce to you a distinguished university professor and Vice Dean, Dr. Vic Adamowitz. He is at the Faculty of Agricultural, Life and Environmental Sciences and at the University of Alberta, and he is being beamed in tonight, or this morning here in Canberra, from Edmonton, Alberta. Over to you, Vic.
Thanks very much, Quentin, and I hope everybody can hear me. I hope my microphone's working.
Yes.
So, very good. As Quentin mentioned, I'm speaking to you from Edmonton in Canada. Let me first acknowledge that I'm located on Treaty 6 territory. We respect the histories, languages, and cultures of our First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples who enrich our vibrant community. My field of research is in research and teaching is environmental economics, and particularly the kind of analysis that's used to support decision-making, including water allocation. And I play an advisory role for the Water Justice Hub and the ARC Laureate on exactly these kinds of values. And really, Anna did a fine job of outlining and describing the kinds of issues that we struggle with. You can think about the kinds of tools that economists use to help support decisions, things like benefit cost analysis. These are measuring the costs and benefits of different policies or programs, but to really be comprehensive, these tools should include non-market or environmental values. And that's the area that I work in. So what are environmental values? These may include the values of changes in air quality or water quality, or the impacts of water quality on human health, ecosystems, biodiversity, those kinds of components that are not typically traded in markets and therefore not reflected in market prices and values. And so sometimes they get left out. They might get given a value of 0 in an economic analysis or decision-making tool, when they can be very important to people and of course have significant value. So these are the kinds of measures that we would use to examine environmental goods and services as well as cultural services. Now, we try to measure these in as rigorous as possible ways, and we're always learning new ways, and I think the field has substantially improved and advanced over the last decade. And I think it's really important to bring these types of values to the discussion as a part of decision-making and implicitly as a part of justice, to bring all the information that we can to bear on important decisions. Not only can valuation inform decision-making in a sense of aggregate outcomes, but it can also help us understand the distribution of impacts. Who is being adversely affected by a particular policy? Who is disproportionately losing or being harmed more than those who are benefiting? And I think that's, again, an important part of justice and an important part of economic analysis and decision-making. But recently, I've been increasingly interested and starting to conduct some research on valuation and non-market valuation in the context of Indigenous people. And Indigenous people may be more significantly affected by changes in ecosystem services because of their linkage to the land, the importance of traditional land and water in their communities and their cultures. And that's one of the things that we're learning, is that the traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous perspectives don't separate land from water from people, as Anne mentioned. And as I understand it, that's an important component of traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge. That's the kind of change that we need to bring to environmental valuation techniques. These types of methods are showing us that the value of what we've traditionally thought of water in Indigenous communities may be much greater, and new methods are revealing new significant insights into water valuation. So I see my role as providing the scientific advice on environmental valuation to assess the impact on communities and people in general, to understand the distribution of benefits as an aspect of justice. But I also think that rigorous evaluation and comprehensive evaluation of benefits, costs, and distribution provides transparency into the process of policy and program evaluation. And when done well, I think this illustrates what we know, but it also provides insights into what we really don't know that well and need to understand more. And I think that transparency and honesty is also a component of justice. And so that's the role I hope to play with this team and in this particular program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vic. Much appreciated. And so the launch will close with Dr. Kat Taylor, and hopefully we'll get some audio from Kat. So Kat is connecting to us from Broome, Western Australia. So over to you, Kat. You are Postdoctoral Research Fellow as part of the Water Justice Hub on the Australian Research Council Fellowship Laureate. Over to you.
Thank you, Quentin. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Ah, fantastic. Oh, that's one moment. That's very fortunate. So good morning, everyone, and good evening to our friends who are located all around the planet. It's wonderful to join you with audio. And I'm here in Broome in Western Australia, and I wanted to firstly pay respects to Yagara elders, past and present, and also acknowledge the beautiful country here, and just express my gratitude for the teaching from both elders and country. I'd also like to honour the practice of bringing water to the meeting, as Sheri has told us about. So I'm a Western Australian. I've lived here for most of my life, and it is an enormous pleasure to be able to continue to work here and contribute to what's happening in this state around water, and to work with some great people here. I recently completed my PhD at the Crawford School of Public Policy, and during that process I collaborated with some Aboriginal prescribed body corporates on policy, water policy for country, and that was an enormous privilege as well. So today, as we close up, I just wanted to follow up on this, the themes that we've been hearing today about utopia from Helen and hope from Quentin, and to talk to you about vision, because I think vision is really a necessity. It's probably not news to anyone here, but I feel like I often need to remind myself that imagining the future in a hopeful way is a really crucial part of the practice that leads to transformative change and social justice outcomes. Of course, you also need action, but having a vision is absolutely necessary, and it's a really valid part of the process. And that's because transformative change always starts with an idea. We heard earlier from Poelina in her talk about the Martuwarra Council and how that started with the Fitzroy Declaration. And now the dream has grown, and it's a story that's gaining global attention to promote water justice. I'd like to refer to Linda Tuiwai-Smith's book, Decolonising Methodologies, and a section where she's writing about Indigenous people's strategies that dream a new dream and set a new vision. And she writes, and I quote directly, that the confidence of knowing that we have survived and can only go forward provides some impetus to a process of envisioning. In New Zealand, for example, tribes which began their grievance claims against the Crown last century have now not only had their claims heard, but are negotiating settlements. For the people who began the process, these settlements were simply dreams. If they had listened to politicians, taken the mainstream media seriously, taken heed of scholars and commentators, they would not have begun. And that's end quote. So here, Tuiwai-Smith is talking very specifically, of course, about collective vision as an emancipatory tool as used by Indigenous peoples. But when, of course, we can talk in more general terms about vision as a prerequisite for social change, and I think that's something that can have be taken up by anyone who wants water justice. In Australia, for example, we need to look beyond what we see as the current norms and realities and this box that we put them in, question those assumptions, as so many have done, and in particular, want to point out the way these assumptions are really critiqued by Virginia Marshall's book, Overturning Aquanullius. Now, what would it look like if we did overturn Aquanullius in Australia? What possibilities would emerge? So I would say that as researchers, questioning assumptions is vital because we need to open up for that spaciousness of thinking and to allow futures to emerge that we can't imagine under one paradigm. Once that's gone, what becomes possible? For non-Indigenous Australians like me, it is quite a process of unlearning and relearning. And when I was thinking about this talk, I was remembering when Sheri, Quentin and I were writing a paper, and Sheri Longboat reminded me that justice is for water, not just for people. And suddenly I saw water justice from a completely different angle. And it removed the blinkers that I had on that aspect. So for researchers, so much of our role is about dismantling these hegemonies of thought, both in the literature but also in ourselves. So I think that deconstruction is one step towards having a vision. I'd like to finish by saying that having a constructive vision for water justice or social justice is never an individual endeavour, because there's huge power that comes from a collective vision and sharing that vision. And we have this wonderful hub here that's connecting people together. I know so many of the people that are part of the hub and have come to launch, and thank you so much for coming and sharing this today. And I know the people here are creative, adaptable, hardworking, have a huge wealth of knowledge. And so I can just see this as a complete powerhouse for water justice. So let's work together on that magic ingredient, that vision for water justice, and that's both justice for people and waters. And I look forward to collaborating with you in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kat, and what a way to end the Water Justice Hub launch. And I do have some water in the hand to remind us, as Sheri did so very well put, that it's not just justice, it's justice for water as well. I want to give a special thanks in this room to Virginia and to John. Thank you for coming and presenting with us live. Thank you, of course, to all the people who joined us via Zoom, and of course Helen Sullivan, who helped us launch the hub. And special thanks, of course, to Dr. Aunty Matilda House for Welcome to Country. So there's a lot to do. There's a lot's been said, and now we need to translate voice and ideas and vision into action and implementation. And that's what we will seek to do over the coming years. I thank you all for joining us. Water, of course, is part of creation, but justice is a human invention. So we need to be part of creating that justice right here and right now. Thank you again. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for helping. Mai Nguyen, thank you for everything you've done in organising this event and all the friends who've joined us. So thank you again. I wish you well. And you'll be hearing more from us in the Water Justice Hub. Look to our website and look to the newsletters that we'll be sending out. Thank you again. All the best. Bye-bye.